You see history a little different now, don't you? There's a whole undercurrent in history that's completely different from what's out in the headlines. Well, you can actually see the headlines, but behind it there's a whole current, and God's working. And I only gave you I gave you quite a bit, but there's a lot more of what happened in American history leading up to the rebirth of the nation of Israel. But one of the things I want to leave you with is the importance of God using the church. That the prayers, the intercession, the fasting, the getting the sense of the political or the spiritual temperature. And the church rose to the occasion 120 years ago, 130 years ago. And so, can't we do that today? You know, they did it by faith because they could see, they got the feeling of the time and what was going on. And it was time for the restoration of the nation of Israel. But we're at the end now. You know, they did it by, it doesn't take much faith. In my opinion, it doesn't take much faith. All you got to do is watch the news and watch ISIS and watch Israel and Hamas and Israel and Hezbollah and Israel and Iran and Israel and the United States and all. I mean, it doesn't take too much faith in our part. There it is. It's right in front of us. So why not rise to the occasion again and intercede and cry out to the Lord and be a part of His end-time prophetic plan rather than being bench warmers? I want to be first team. Right? Amen. Put me in, Lord, first team. And we can do it by prayer. I mean, sometimes there's nothing else we can do. We can't get involved in world events in Washington and Jerusalem and all of that. But we certainly can in prayer, and certainly do it by witnessing. I have down there, I forgot to bring it up, but I have two prophetic newspapers. One's called The Last Trumpet, and one's called The Last Shofar. The Last Shofar is specifically written, it's a team member of mine, we work together. It's specifically written to win Jewish people to the Lord. The Last Trumpet actually was first written in 1980. When you read it, you'll think, oh, someone just put it together, last year or recently. It was put together in 1980, and the things that were written in it are all now coming to pass right in front of us. So both of them are excellent prophetic tools. And I have two brochures that go with it. Jesus Christ Came to Heal the Brokenhearted and the 666 Surveillance System. And all of them together, they're just winning. Every day I'm getting reports of Muslims coming to the Lord in Pakistan, and Hindus coming to the Lord in India, prisoners coming to the Lord. And so please take the material, it's free, and use it. Use it. Now's the prophetic word, when the Lord returns, it's over. So now, it's either now or never. Amen? Amen. Okay. So, if you remember, things are fine with the United States and the Lord right up to the rebirth of the nation of Israel. And then we go to October 30th. Whoops, I turned it off. And, let's go to these scriptures first. Joel chapter 3, verse 1 and 2. It's a warning from the Lord not to divide the land, and that the nations will be judged for my people Israel divided my land. So Joel is a tremendous warning, along with Obadiah 1:15. Yeah, I use Obadiah 15. For the day of the Lord is near, and what you have done to Israel shall be done unto you. So if a country tampers with the integrity of the nation of Israel, with Jerusalem in particular, that is going to come back on that nation. There's warnings in scriptures. Zechariah chapter 12 about touching Jerusalem. There's huge warnings there in scriptures about not touching Jerusalem, trying to divide Jerusalem. So when we get to October 30th, 1991, here's George Bush Sr., and it's in Madrid, Spain. And in all fairness to George Bush, I don't think he was doing this on purpose to defy God. I think it was he's a political animal, and he was looking for political expedience. And he was riding on the coattails of the big win over Saddam Hussein, and all of a sudden he called for a regional Middle East peace plan, which we know now as the Madrid peace plan. And Israel didn't want any part of it. Israel had to get dragged into this. But so it officially met on October 30th, 1991. And I look at that as a line of demarcation between America being blessed and cursed. Because President Bush led us into violating God's word. We should just leave Israel alone. I mean, if Israel wants to divide the land, that's between them and God, but not us to get involved behind the scenes, putting all sorts of pressure and threats, and doing everything possible to get Israel to divide the land. We should have nothing to do with it. But we did. So here is what happened. Since 1991, it's been the official policy. Barack Obama did not invent this, what he's doing to Israel. That's all, he's picked that up from George Bush Jr., from Bill Clinton, and then from George Bush Sr. Okay. Now, Bush started, this is October 30th, 1991, and this is Bush's statement. Throughout the Middle East, we seek a stable and enduring settlement. We've not defined what this means. Indeed, I make these points with no map showing where the final borders are to be drawn. Nevertheless, we believe territorial compromise is essential for creating peace. That's a nice way of saying Israel must divide the land, or the land must be given up for peace. Here is him, this actual picture of him giving the speech. Okay, now here's the front page of the New York Times. Now years ago when I would give these presentations, I would use newspapers a lot like this to show how they work together on the front page. But we don't really use newspapers, at least I don't, a lot of people don't. It's kind of everything's on the internet. So I can't really show too much of the modern events on the front page. Just say that, show a picture of what happened this day and what we were doing to Israel on this day, and then another article showing what the disaster happened. But back then, 20 years ago, 23 years ago, the New York Times was the leading newspaper. And here you see disaster, and here is the Madrid peace process right there. Now notice this, disaster, front page, peace process. And that disaster became known as the perfect storm. A book was written about it, and a movie was made about it. This turned out to be a best-selling book. And the reason it's called the perfect storm is 3 weather patterns came together that occur once every 100 to 200 years. So it was a perfect storm because weather patterns coming in these directions had to perfectly hit at the right time in the right place to create this storm. And it's known as a retrograde storm. So right up here is where all of these weather patterns met. One came from the west, one came from the Arctic, and a Hurricane Grace coming up the Atlantic. They all met right about here, and they created a hurricane. When's the last time you heard a hurricane created on Nova Scotia in October? Anytime. But in October. And it came the wrong way. That's why they call it retrograde, backwards. See, here we are here in Pennsylvania, and we send storms this way. Storms don't come that way. So this storm came the wrong way, and it came down the coast of the United States, and it went all the way into the Caribbean like this. And here's a picture of what it looked like on October 30th, and it's almost like filling up the Atlantic Ocean. That's how big it was. Up to this time, and I think still, this is the most powerful storm ever recorded. In the Atlantic Ocean, they have buoys, and the buoys stopped functioning when the waves were 110 to 120 feet high. And the frequency, it's the height of the frequency, so the waves were one after the other, And the Navy builds ships, warships, to withstand, tremendous category of storms. And this storm was so powerful that even naval ships couldn't withstand it. It would sink naval ships. That's how powerful it was. The most ferocious storm, I think, even to today, recorded. I don't know about the Pacific, but definitely the North Atlantic. And right here is President Bush's home in Kennebunkport, Maine. And this is a neck of land. That sticks out. Here's the Atlantic Ocean here, and this is a bay behind his house. But here's his house right there. And there's a look at his house, President Bush's house. So what happened was, on the day he was giving the speech, I don't know if it was while he was giving the speech, but definitely the day he gave the speech, 30-foot waves rose up off the ocean because of the perfect storm, and they went right over his home and destroyed it. The superstructure of the home remained, but the inside was all completely destroyed by the storm. The same day that he was initiating the Madrid peace plan to divide the land of Israel, to touch the land of Israel, his own land, his own home was destroyed. Now this is what the New York Times, this is reported in the New York Times. A shaken President Bush and his wife Barbara led reporters through their devastated vacation home today, clambering over broken timbers and shattered glass to show where antiques and political mementos have been washed away this weekend by a powerful ocean storm. When we walked into the house, it was so sad. It was a sad situation, Mr. Fitzgerald said, getting that Mr. Bush and his wife seemed stunned by the scope of the damage. So on the very day he touched Israel, his own home was started, his own home was destroyed. And this starts the sequence of these tremendous disasters hitting America connected with touching Israel. And you name the great disaster, Hurricane Katrina, the tremendous tornado outbreak there in Joplin, Missouri, stock market crashes, gigantic forest fires, floods. They're all, if you look at it, it's starting on the day we're doing something to Israel. And usually not a day before or a day after, on that day like this. This was on the day. This wasn't a month before, a month after, or a week before, or a week after. This was on the very day the President of the United States touched Israel. This is what happened to him, and America. Now we go to the next year, and this is August of 1992, and I want you to see this. Thousands homeless in Florida storm. This here is, up to that time, is the greatest natural disaster ever to hit America. This is Hurricane Andrew. Category 5 hurricane. There's only been 3 Category 5s in American history to hit America. And this is the third one and the last one so far. It hit southern Florida. So here's the headline. Now, look what's over here. Bush's gains from convention nearly evaporated, latest poll. Right here, it's becoming evident that George Bush Sr. is not going to be reelected. And at the end of the Iraqi war there, he had like 92% popularity. So his popularity kept on ebbing away, ebbing away. We get here showing it's obvious he's not going to be elected. And look what's in between. The Madrid peace process was moved to American soil. And the very first meeting they had on American soil, this hit. The meeting was at 10 o'clock in the morning, and Hurricane Andrew had crossed Florida and went into the Gulf at 6 a.m. So 4 hours difference between this disaster and this meeting. But I want you to grasp this. This is the man that did this. He's politically being destroyed now, right here. At the same time, the land, the Madrid peace process, they meet for the first time on American soil in the greatest disaster ever to hit America. All together in the front page for everybody to see. Isn't that amazing? Same thing, 4 hours difference between this and this. This is just some results of the damage of the storm. Okay, now here is President Clinton meeting with Assad. He's dead now. His son is in power, Bashar Assad, and he's the one that's battling ISIS there in Syria. And they meet in Geneva on January 16, 1994. And I didn't know he was meeting. Now, I knew America was under judgment at this point. I was following that very closely. And I didn't know he was meeting with Assad in Geneva. So I remember it was the evening news, the late night news. And I happened to be sitting on the floor watching the TV. I had my dog next to me, I remember. And a soundbite came on about Clinton meeting Assad in Geneva. And Israel wasn't there. But Clinton gave this speech, and he said, basically, the Israelis aren't going to like this, but they're going to have to give up the Golan Heights for peace. Well, the hair on the back of my head actually stood up. It did. I said, Lord, and the arrogance, it was bad enough what he said, but it was the arrogance of the way he said it. And I said, Lord, wow, I remember crying out to him. I said, this is terrible. I mean, I could feel judgment in the air. So I went to bed, and I woke up the next morning, and I turned the news on, and we had the second greatest natural disaster in U.S. history. That was the Northridge earthquake, up to that time. So within hours of the President of the United States making an international speech saying that Israel, whether they liked it or not, was going to have to give up the Golan Heights, the land of the United States was devastated by the second greatest natural disaster. But this one here is really eerie because here's Northridge right here, and here is Los Angeles, and this is the San Gabriel Mountains. This earthquake was so powerful that it actually moved these mountains up closer. It moved them a couple feet closer. It was an extremely powerful earthquake. It only was 6.6 on the Richter scale, and it amazed the scientists the power that it did for the damage it did for the amount on the Richter scale it was. It shouldn't have done that. But when you look at it, when they examined it, they found that this earthquake was two earthquakes in one. In that there are two types of earthquake. There is a slip fault where the earth moves like this, back and forth. And then there's a subduction zone one, where the one part of the land goes under the other. This is the one that does a lot of damage, real big damage, the subduction zone. And what they determined was that two earthquakes occurred simultaneously, and that the buildings in Northridge, some of them got thrown 12 feet in the air because you had the subduction zone, and then you had the sliding back and forth, which added to the damage. So there were two earthquakes, they said, that occurred simultaneously. That's like never happened before. But to make it worse than that, they never found the fault or faults. It just happened. Isn't that amazing? It just happened. That's why here it says experts try to put a face on no name fault, because they never found the fault that caused this earthquake. Now, I knew nothing about Northridge. I don't know much about California. Well, I know very little about California. But this is an article that I came across about Northridge and the earthquake. And this is by this is about a pornographer. And it turns out that the pornography capital of the United States is Northridge, California. 80% of all the video pornography is made in Northridge. So this is what one of the leading pornographers said. These religious fanatics think it's the Lord's way of telling us, hey, straighten out your act, admitted Letty Freelander, president of New Beginnings, which distributes adults' videos, magazines, and sex toys. And it says here, more than 80% of the nation's adult videos come out of the valley, and most of those businesses lie within a 5-mile radius of the quake's epicenter. It is the porn capital of the world, said Jan LaRue, a lawyer at the National Law Center for Children and Families. So the Lord sent sent an earthquake right under the feet of the pornography industry that the wicked knew it. I wonder if God's people knew it. The wicked knew it. And it happened within hours of the President of the United States proclaiming that Israel had to give away the Golan Heights for peace. So there's a whole undercurrent. We see the earthquake. When you get behind it, we've got the United States touching Israel, and it's centered under the feet of the pornography industry. Now, the pornography industry had billions of dollars, and they rebuilt many of them the buildings were completely destroyed, and they rebuilt it. But looking at this, I believed that America was warned back then, that God's well aware of the pornography industry and what it's doing. And the next judgment, I don't believe it's going to be any recovery. The area will be completely leveled and turned to Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, this is, again, just to show you, these are just samples. You know what, let me see. Oh yeah, okay. I just pulled a sample to show you from the newspapers. Here it is, April 29, 2002. Israel agrees to lift Arafat siege. And Israel had Arafat cornered in a building where he couldn't get out because he was directing the Intifada against Israel. And President Bush Jr., for whatever reason, put enormous pressure on Israel to let Arafat go free. So the day that Bush did that, he put this pressure on Sharon to let Arafat go free. That the greatest tornado outbreak in Maryland's history occurred. And what was interesting, it was the first time that an F5 tornado hit Maryland. And what was interesting on the weather map, I got to do it backwards to show you, but anyways, here's Washington, D.C., and here's like southern Maryland where this tornado hit. And when the storm came, the tornado went like directly over the White House, like maybe 500,000 feet up, and it came gradually till it hit southern Maryland. You know, and everybody asked the question, why didn't it hit the White House? I don't know, but I can tell you that that storm, F5 tornado, went directly over the White House and kind of came in for a landing 15, 20 miles southeast of the White House. But there's the type of headlines that you see all the time. The United States is interfering with God's prophetic plan. This man Arafat, his whole existence was to kill Jews. And he was leading the Intifada from, he was being cut off, that he couldn't lead it. And Bush, for whatever reason, demanded that he be let go. And this is what happened to America. Okay, now here's a meeting between George Bush Jr. and Ariel Sharon. This is early August of 2005 in Washington. And Israel is about to give away or to pull out of Gaza. And this is his speech. It's August 23rd. I want to congratulate Prime Minister Sharon for having made a very tough decision. The Prime Minister made a courageous decision to withdraw from Gaza. This is a step one in the development of a democracy. What a joke. This is a very hopeful period. Again, I applaud Prime Minister Sharon for making a decision that has really changed the dynamics on the ground and has really provided hope for the Palestinian people. My vision, my hope, is that one day we'll see two states, two democratic states living side by side in peace. Look at that date, October 23rd. That's this meeting here. Okay, this is Hurricane Katrina, and some brave soul took this picture. It was this was somewhere on the Mississippi coast, and the storm surge was like 30 feet. So I don't know who took it, but I read that he survived the storm surge. But it's about, this is the storm surge coming to land now. It's going to be, there's like the height of it up there, it's like 30 feet high. And Obadiah 1:15, what the United States did to Israel, was George Bush twisted the arm of Ariel Sharon, the enormous pressure to, the Israelis had 21 settlements in Gaza. And Bush wanted them out as a show of good faith to the Palestinians that Israel meant it wanted peace. And this was going to be the proof by the Israelis pulling out of Gaza. What happened was, the following year in January, there was an election. And then soon after the election, there was sort of like a little civil war, and Hamas won and came to power. And Hamas has a sworn covenant, or Hamas has a covenant that it exists for the destruction of Israel and to kill all the Jews in the world. That's the function of Hamas. That's their covenant. So this very seldom comes out in the news when Israel's at war with Hamas in Gaza, that Israel can't reconcile. As long as Hamas is in power, Israel can't. How can Israel possibly reconcile with a group that has a covenant that they exist to destroy the nation of Israel and kill Jews? So it's like locked into a perpetual battle there, which we'll get into the next show of what happens. But but Bush wanted a good faith to show the Palestinians that Israel meant in good faith that they wanted peace. So the Israeli army came and forced the closure of all the settlements in Gaza and in 3 other locations. So, but I want to show you here what happened to the United States when we pressured Israel. Prior to the removal, the Israeli government called the Jews to evacuate their homes from 25 settlements. The government called on residents to evacuate their homes prior to the hurricane. The hurricane occurred days after that speech, by the way, just days after Bush and Sharon met. On August 17th, Israel ordered a mandatory evacuation of the settlements. On September 7th, the mayor of New Orleans ordered a mandatory evacuation of the city. The evacuation of 12,000 Jews was the largest in Jewish history since 1948. Several million Americans were evacuated in the Hurricane Katrina. The Israeli government disarmed the settlers. New Orleans police attempted to disarm the citizens. The evacuation destroyed thousands of Jewish homes. The hurricane destroyed and damaged over 500,000 American homes. This is days later after the evacuation of the Jewish people under pressure from George Bush Jr. Many Jewish people felt abandoned by the government, and the Americans felt abandoned by the United States government's failure to timely respond to Hurricane Katrina. The Israelis were boarded on buses and taken to locations all over Israel. People trapped in New Orleans were loaded on buses and taken to shelters all over the United States. The Israeli government barred citizens of Gaza from their homes. American citizens were in destroyed areas barred from their homes. August 23rd, the President congratulated Prime Minister Sharon for dismantling Jewish settlements, while on August 29th, the President declared Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama disaster areas. So what we did to Israel, we should just stay out of it. If Israel wants to give Gaza back or give Gaza away, that's Israel's business, not the business of the United States. Because it brings us right in a direct confrontation with the God of Israel over his prophetic word and his covenant. The Israeli government returned the settlements in Gaza to the Palestinians on September 12th. On September 13th, the President was humiliated that he publicly took responsibility for the federal government's failure during Hurricane Katrina's relief operations. on this here, what this is headlines from articles from Bush's political advisors saying that his presidency was destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and he lost credibility with a vast majority of the American people that he never recovered from. So his presidency took a huge hit from his response to Hurricane Katrina. And if you look at it spiritually, his presidency was, however you want to put words on it, lost credibility, destroyed, hurt at the exact time that he violated God's prophetic word about the nation. So if you remember Bush Sr., what happened to his presidency when he touched Israel? Remember the New York Times? The front page, his presidency is collapsing in the polls. Israel's meeting on the land of the United States for the first time to divide the land, Hurricane Andrew. So the president, George Bush Sr.'s presidency was like, I'm looking at it as I put it together here, spiritually, it was destroyed as he touched Israel, and the same thing happened to his son. It doesn't matter to God if you're a Republican or Democrat. If you violate his word, you're judged. But likewise, if you come under the blessings if you do what's right according to his word, you come under the blessings. Amen. See, and just a little word on politics here. It's like getting Clinton out, for example. I'm not getting into Republican Democrat stuff. People would say, oh, we got to get Clinton out. We got to get Clinton out. He's doing, okay, all right. You want him out, fine, okay. But then you look at Bush. Well, what is Bush going to do? Well, he's going to continue Clinton's policy about dividing the land of Israel. So, we're still in the frying pan. We got to look spiritually through God's eyes. We look at things politically, like, we got to get this Democrat out. We got to get this Republican in. Now, Democrats will say, well, we got to get this Republican in. We got to get this out. We got to get this Democrat in. But forget about politics and go above it and say, well, are they agreeing with God's word? Are they lining up with God's word? And Bush Jr. did not line up with God's word. You'll see it in my book how I detail what he did. And the nation suffered greatly under him, and he suffered greatly, personally, for what he did. This is just, these are the 10, now FEMA never upgraded this. I've been checking. It's frozen at what you see here. But these are the 10 greatest FEMA relief costs, not the 10 greatest total amount of damage, but what FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, paid. Hurricane Katrina, in my book, Israel. Northridge earthquake, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Georges, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Ivan, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Andrew, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Charlie, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Francis, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Janine, in my book, Israel. Tropical Storm Allison, in my book, Israel. Hurricane Hugo, abortion. It was a Supreme Court decision, pro-abortion decision, on the day Hurricane Hugo hit in 1999. Every one of these top disasters, every one of them has a touching Israeli component in it. I documented in my book, and I show you the documentation. How much time is that?
Wait a minute.
This is a backup program that I have. The original one, it's not there. So I just want to see what I have on this one. So hang on here as I go forward. Okay. Yeah, I've got good stuff on here. I didn't know if I'd show you pictures or just have to talk about it. Okay. Now, we've been in a economic quagmire or an economic depression, recession in some places, depends on where you are and what industry you're in. It's a depression, other places it's a recession. And the reason we're not in a full-blown, like 1930s type depression is basically that the governments have gone into such debt, the federal government and the state governments. What are we now, about $18 trillion in federal debt? 18 trillion, I mean, you can't even imagine the size of that debt. In various states, there's various cities now that are going under, on the verge of going under. Detroit went under. There's about half a dozen Harrisburg went under. I don't even know how they exist. If they fired everybody in Harrisburg and got rid of the police, the fire department, everybody, they still couldn't pay the debt. That's how massive the debt in Harrisburg is. But there are other cities also that are on the verge. The state of New Jersey, I just read this week, their ratings have been, bond ratings have been really dropped because the state is insolvent. But if you trace the economic situation we're in now, you go back into 2013, 10, and you go back, you'll come back to 2007, and it's, we go to July 16, 2007. And President Bush gave a speech about Israel and the Middle East. And what's interesting about this is I watch this stuff daily. I have a blog. I report this on my blog. It's John McTernan's Insights. And this came out of no place. There was no prior warning. All of a sudden, he just gave this speech. And this is after Katrina. And it says they must guarantee that a Palestinian state is viable and contiguous. Now, that word contiguous, I highlighted it there because it's very important. When you look on a map, like here's Israel right here, here's the Mediterranean Sea, here's Israel. Gaza is here, and what we call the West Bank is here. And it's about a 30-mile gap between them. And he wanted a corridor to unite Gaza and the West Bank, so it's like cutting Israel in half with this corridor. That's what he meant by contiguous. Also, Jerusalem. It's been the American policy since George Bush Sr. Although George Bush Sr. didn't talk about it, he rarely talked about it. American policy is that Jerusalem is to be the capital of the Palestinian state. Barack Obama did not invent that. George Bush was for it, Clinton, but they were less kind of outspoken as Obama. So Jerusalem was on the table. Bush called it the occupation of the West Bank. He doesn't recognize the covenant that the Jewish people have with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Unauthorized outposts. At the same time, Israelis should find other practical ways to reduce their footprint without reducing their security. Okay, so on July 16th, he gives the speech about dividing Jerusalem, dividing Israel, having this contiguous landmass between Gaza and the West Bank. On July 19th, the stock market reaches an all-time height of 14,000. Now it's just over 17,000. And it was real interesting is I document in my books that when the stock market is at its height is when these judgments come. So we're watching now, the stock market is just like this week reached an all-time high, and I'm waiting for the rug to be pulled out from under it. So on July 19th, the stock market reaches an all-time high then of 14,000. And on July 20th, Now, that's 4 days after the speech. 1 day after the stock market reaches an all-time high, the stock market falls 159 points on subprime issues. Now, this day here, if you trace and go back and back and back, July 20th, 2007 is when the whole economic thing begins to unravel. It was Monday, the speech is made, Thursday, the all-time high, and Friday it begins to unravel. The reason it begins to unravel is if you were to study the stock market during 2007, it was up, 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 up. No end in sight. No talk about subprime issues, no talk about a stock market bubble or anything like that. It was just going higher and higher and higher. Subprime issues were not anywhere to be seen. Now, what happened was they were huge amounts of loans were made that were worthless. You know, they would give loans to someone that wasn't showing any income for a $300,000 mortgage. No way of paying it back. And they would take these loans and bury them. And I don't know why they were doing it. Some of it was forced by the government, other reasons. And after so many years, the volume of these bad loans began to accumulate, that it became like unmanageable. So right here in July of this week, all of a sudden these issues come to the surface. And during the weekend in July back then, the Wall Street, whatever you want to call them, my grandfather had very bad words to say. I couldn't repeat them here. He went through the Depression and he told me all about it. He didn't like Wall Street nor the bankers. But they all thought about it and they said, you know what? In our terminology, they had an epiphany. And they said, this doesn't look good. So they went back on Monday and the great crash started. The great run on the stock market began. So when does it begin? It begins on July 20th, when all of a sudden the subprime loan issues focused, and then the next week the stock market nearly plunged into an economic black hole. The stock market fell 311 points in 1 day, and for the week it lost 4.3%. The dollar was plunging, oil prices surged, the world economy was heading into troubled times. He touches Israel, stock market at its highest, the trouble becomes obvious. The next week, the crash is on. And we have been muddling through this for 7 years now. High unemployment, stagnation, no jobs being made except government jobs, huge debt being built up. Someone's going to have to pay this debt somewhere. We're like living in an illusion. We're living in an economic illusion right now. But here is where it goes, right there. On July 27th, the headline from the New York Times read, "Global stock market tumbled amid deepening credit fears." On July 28th, a second day of declines caps worst week in Wall Street in years. Then in July, he called for a conference to be held in November about Israel in Annapolis. Let's see. The president set the end of 2008 as the date for the creation of a Palestinian state. So within a year, he wanted a Palestinian state created within a year. During the Annapolis conference, the economy was continuing to collapse. The stock market was falling. On November 27th, the headlines in the New York Times reported stocks now in a correction, down 10% from recent high. Foreclosures have profound impact on the report warns. So during the meeting here to divide Israel, the stock market is collapsing again. The meeting coincided with a major downturn in the stock market. While the conference was meeting, the stock market was classified into a correction. Okay, now I'll leave that there for a second. So what happens is the economy is in turmoil in the end of 2007, which is, I showed you the date that it starts. So after this meeting in January, Bush decides he's going to go to Israel. He wants to meet with Sharon. The day he takes off, and I don't have this on here, the day he takes off, there was, you have to see it on a map, there is a line of tornadoes. Now this is like January 10th. A line of tornadoes from Alabama to Wisconsin, straight up the United States like this, as he's going to Israel. Never has this ever happened before. When have you ever heard of tornadoes in Wisconsin in January? It's like the perfect storm being created in October, a hurricane being created in October and coming up, the wrong way. You never hear of this. So there was a line of tornadoes going from Alabama, straight line, right up the country, like that. He lands in Israel, and the stock market is in convulsions. In fact, I thought, as I was watching this, that it was the end. I thought that it was going to be a 1929 type crash, and this was going to be just wipe out the economy. He stayed about 3 or 4 days, and the stock market's dropping 250 points, 320 points, 240 points, every day. He leaves Israel, he gets on the plane to come back here, the stock market stabilizes. Then in March, Vice President Cheney decides he's going to go over to Israel and kind of encourage the creation of a Palestinian state. So Cheney goes over to Israel. He's over there like 3 days. The first day he's over there, it drops 300 points, then 200 points, then 280 points. He leaves, the stock market stabilizes. So each time, again, this is in my book, each time we're touching Israel, the stock market goes crazy and it takes big falls. Then we leave Israel alone and it stabilizes. So if you look at it, we go from the high up here, Bush touches Israel, it takes this big drop, then it stabilizes. Then he has a meeting in November, it goes crazy, it drops, it stabilizes. He goes to Israel in January, it goes crazy, it drops, it stabilizes. Then Cheney goes to Israel in March, it goes crazy, then it stabilizes. So it was down in steps. You can actually see this, down in steps. And then Condoleezza Rice, Secretary of State, she would go to Israel, and she goes to Israel, and literally the entire state of Iowa is underwater. Floods, massive, massive floods. The headlines were Condoleezza Rice in Israel and Iowa being completely, huge sections of Iowa were completely underwater. And the stock market is melting down. So she goes to Israel for 2 or 3 days, stock market, down it goes, she comes back, and then like in June she goes, July she goes, all the way. The whole downward of the stock market is in steps exactly to the day as we're touching Israel. Then the Lehman Brothers, remember, if you follow economics, the Lehman Brothers crashed in September. Condoleezza Rice had been there, and the U.S. ambassador, assistant ambassador, let it out of the bag that Condoleezza Rice was coming because to Israel because they almost had reached a peace agreement, and that she was coming to put the final touches on dividing Jerusalem. And then the big days happened. On September 25th, to promote his bailout, the president invited 2 presidential candidates and other congressional leaders to the White House to discuss the economic crisis. The meeting took place at 4 p.m. Just 3 hours prior to this meeting, the president met with Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority, to discuss the progress of the Annapolis Conference to create a Palestinian state. At the height of the economic turmoil, the president was meeting with Abbas to discuss the dividing of Jerusalem. I mean, hours. He's got Abbas in the White House to promote the Palestinian state and to divide Jerusalem. 3 hours later, he's meeting with Obama and McCain to try and drum up support for this bailout that he's doing to keep the United States and the world economy from collapsing. Literally, these are happening from this, almost within hours of each other. So as we're dividing Israel, putting enormous pressure on Israel, our entire economy is blowing apart at the very same day. Now watch this. On September 29th, Rosh Hashanah, the market fell 777 points, the greatest one-day crash. Notice Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. From the Bible, October 9th, 2008, Yom Kippur. In fact, this is coming up next week. Rosh Hashanah, I think, is the 24th this year. On October 9th, Yom Kippur, the market fell 679 points, the third greatest crash. So look at this, look at the days that the market's crashing. On October 9th, the market reached an all-time high. Exactly 1 year later, it was crashing. On October 10th, the 10 days of awe between these holidays, the market lost 2,400 points, or 22%. On October 15th, the Feast of Tabernacles, the market lost 737 points, the second greatest one-day crash. First greatest crash, second greatest crash, third greatest crash, all occurring as we're attempting to divide Jerusalem, as the world economy is in turmoil, as Bush is doing everything he can. And he's almost out of the presidency. This is like the last things he's doing. This is the very last thing he's doing. He wanted desperately to divide Israel, to divide Jerusalem, and create a Palestinian state. And we nearly lost our economy because of this. Okay, just to show you Barack Obama, this is the speech he gave on May 29th. I have the wrong date. This is all May 27th. This is the one I didn't correct. Yeah, this is May 22nd. Here's the president giving the speech, and it was to a Jewish group Sunday morning, and it finished on yeah, okay. He finishes. I got it from his website, the presidential website. He finished his speech at 11:20 a.m. Eastern time. The massive Joplin tornado hit at 5:24 p.m. Central Time. There was 6 hours between the two events. And I'm not sure if I got 6 hours, but maybe because you got the time zone right. One of them, I had to correct one of them. I don't think I corrected this one. But here's what happens. So here's what happens. Here's the president giving his speech about dividing the land of Israel. Within hours of that speech, there's Joplin, probably the greatest destruction to a city, one city, from a storm. And I watched, the next day I was watching Sean Hannity. And it's the only time I've seen this. As you watched him, there was a split screen. And on this side was the rescue efforts in Joplin. And on this side was a panel discussing Obama's speech about dividing Israel. You couldn't miss it. I mean, there was it right on the TV, the greatest tornado disaster in American history, and right next to it was Obama dividing Israel, his speech about dividing Israel. And the interesting thing about Joplin, the tornado came from the west to the east, and many of the streets in Joplin that run north-south of the states, like Pennsylvania Avenue, New York Avenue, and that tornado ran and cut right in half, cut the states, all those states right in half through the city, as it went through the city.
The hour's up, John.
Excuse me?
The hour's up.
The hour's up. Okay. Obama backing the Muslim Brotherhood. Okay, we'll let that go. The rest, if you want, you can get from my book. Okay. Take another break.